This is an abridged tutorial to model how to think about your paper topic on cross-cultural connections. Now, of course, you will need to go much more in depth than what I'm going to provide here, but the intent for this online tutorial really is to give you a sense of how to craft your argument for your paper. The paper topic centers around this idea of theme and similarity, that different cultures existing during different time periods considered similar sets of ideas and communicated these ideas visually in relatively consistent ways. It really is a testament to the universality of humanity, that no matter how much we try to divide ourselves and categorize and separate ourselves, we really are one and the same at our core, which I personally think is a beautiful thing. To underscore this argument, we'll be looking at art from both the European tradition and art traditionally considered to be outside of this tradition. Now, the theme that I will address, the paper topic I've assigned myself, is the performance of masculinity. We've seen all throughout time and culture that political power is typically connected to stereotypical notions of masculinity. Although I must add that we have seen a few notable exceptions to this throughout history with certain female rulers. Now, considering this, I have chosen two political works to evidence the performance of masculinity: a Chinese painting of Emperor Wu of the Jin dynasty, and the January page out of the pre-Renaissance book of Hours that belonged to the Duke of Berry. I'm going to start by addressing these images separately, focusing on the context, and then I will discuss the visual features of the pieces together, a sort of comparative situation to support my argument for a conceptual similarity. Now remember, for your paper assignment, you must establish a minimum of 3 visual similarities, and this can include iconography. So at the minimum, your paper must have 3 points of analysis. The key to remember here is that all that you identify and analyze must be brought back to the theme. Keeping this in mind will keep you from going off topic. So my theme is performing masculinity, and as I'm going to try to demonstrate in this tutorial, all things lead back in my analysis of these 2 paintings. All right, so what we're looking at here is a painting of the Emperor Wu of Jin. Let's start with some context. This will be helpful to you moving forward as you build your argument. Emperor Wu was the first emperor of the Jin dynasty, which lasted in China from the 3rd to the 5th century CE. It followed the Three Kingdoms period, which was a time when China was politically fragmented amongst 3 disparate political entities. So as important as the first emperor of this particular dynasty, that Wu conveys this sense of unwavering unified power. Now, how might he achieve such a feat, you wonder? Well, by showing how masculine he is. The masculinity will be used to evidence his authority, and you better not mess with him. I mean, look at him. I certainly am intimidated. What we're looking at here is a depiction of a New Year's feast, which is being presided over by the Duke of Berry, aka John the Magnificent, which is, I think, a pretty good nickname. And he was the patron of this gorgeous illuminated manuscript. The Duke of Berry, John the Magnificent, was a pretty big deal. He was the brother of King Charles V of France. He commissioned the Limbourg brothers to create a book of hours, which was essentially a prayer book that would have its owners praying at specific times throughout the day. Beyond this, there is a bit of political propaganda that underscores the imagery found in this book. So images such as these, like we see here, they're layered. There's both religious and political contextual significance. Basically, the images are showing the Duke as powerful, but at the same time benevolent. He's such a great guy who cares so much about his people. Obviously throwing this great party, right? But there's other images that show, peasants going about their work in this really sort of like accepting way, happy to, give over their labor to this benevolent leader. Basically, he's so great that we should simply just trust him and not really care about or question anything he does. Clearly, he not only has his subject's best interest at heart, but he uses identity as a devout religious man to further reinforce this claim. Smart strategy. All right, let's do some comparisons here. So remember, we are talking about similarities here, and we do need a minimum of 3. And remember, we want to pick things that are going to relate to our theme. So for me, I'm going to pick things I see that are significant in these works of art that relate to a generalized understanding of masculinity. Let's start with my very favorite, which is iconographical analysis. Now, at this point in the semester, there is something that you should pick up immediately on when thinking about political power, looking at this work of art, these 2 works of art, and that would be the headdress. So we both see headdresses. We see headdresses in both of these here. Now, what's interesting is that the Duke of Berry has a sort of 2-in-1 situation going on here. He has this fabulous fur hat, but you see also that he sort of is coincidentally placed in front of this circular fire screen here, which I don't know, sure looks like a giant halo. Of course, this would suggest that he is very religious, almost perhaps even saint-like. And as I said before, this would be a very convenient reference to encourage the passive trust of his subjects. So we see both have headdresses here, but remember, we have to ask ourselves the question, well, how does this relate to masculinity? Think about this for a minute. Pause the video even if you want to really think about this. How might these headdresses reflect masculinity? Now for me, I see it as an enlarging of the figure, making the figures large in size, really emphasizing their dominant physical presence. Stereotypical conceptions of masculinity position men as big and strong and tall. Also, just saying, that sure looks like a phallic symbol right here directly behind the Duke of Berry, just in case we needed a little reminder of his masculine power. Let's look at the way that perhaps gold operates symbolically. I think the use of gold is an interesting similarity in these 2 paintings. We've talked about the significance of gold already in this class, particularly as it related to icon imagery that was produced during the Byzantine period. We know that it relates to a myriad of things, gold, but one thing it does bring to mind to the viewer is the idea of material wealth. One thing that is certain throughout time and place is that wealth and power are inextricably interrelated. Now here is where the challenging task comes in. How do I relate this to masculinity? Now for me, I would try to link it to economic labor and who traditionally possessed material wealth in these past societies. It was typically men that would go out and earn the money and would have control over the finances. Now again, this is a generality, in many ways a stereotype. If I have to assess my own work, which we should always do, at this point I'm going to predict that this is probably going to be a weaker part of my paper. This is kind of a tenuous argument, but do you know how I can fix that? You guessed it, more research to support this claim. Okay, now for both of these images, scale is a really important design principle in its communication of the theme. More specifically, this is seen in the use of hierarchical scale. Both men outsize those around them who are dwarfed in comparison. Now, in terms of connecting this to masculinity, it's the same argument as the headdresses. It's this presentation of these men as big and strong and tall, and that is a physical embodiment of their political power. What exactly creates this size? You want to be as specific as possible in your analysis, always. Don't just say, oh, they're bigger. What makes them bigger? Look at the clothing. It's voluminous. This is what adds the bulk. Because if you look at the Duke of Berry, he's not like significantly larger in hierarchical scale like we have with Emperor Wu. But what gives the sense of him being larger in size is this robe and how it kind of is long like this. This really does give the sense that he's larger in size. The clothing in both cases also have a lot of detail on it, and that's going to attract the viewer's eye. I think another point of compositional significance worth mentioning is that in both pieces, the artist has been really strategic with their use of vertical placement. Notice that both men are unobstructed. They're kind of like front and center in a way, so that the viewer has this clear view of their impressive size. Now, the topic that this analysis addressed is the performance of masculinity, and that's the takeaway here, this idea of performance. These rulers and these examples that I've shown you have made these conscious choices in their representation, such as having a beard, for example, or suggesting large stature through the deliberate selection of garments with thick, heavy drapery, by positioning themselves front and center within a group of people. This is how they perform these notions of masculinity. Now that's going to cover it for analyses, but I want to say a few words on research when writing an art history paper, and I think that this will be helpful to you. When you're researching for an art history paper, a couple of things to keep in mind. So let's say that this is the topic that you're researching. And I'm just going to go back here to the Duke of Berry and the Book of Hours. So you wouldn't want to, in your search term, put in Book of Hours, because that's really specific and it's going to be hard to get hits on that in the library. So probably what I would do is I would put in something like pre-Renaissance paintings, something like this. You kind of start big and then sort of work your way in. So I would find a book on pre-Renaissance paintings and I would look in there and see if it mentions the Book of Hours, which I would think it would, because this is probably one of the most famous pre-Renaissance paintings that was made, aside from Giotto, and you know how I feel about Giotto. Now, let's say that we find a book on pre-Renaissance painting that has this. What I would then do is I would go to the back of the book and look at the bibliography. What sources did this author reference? And maybe those sources are part of the collection at the Yavapai College Library. Remember, too, that we have a very robust interlibrary loan system where we have access to the collection of books in over 40 libraries within our area. So you can send for books from other libraries. They'll bring it over to whatever campus you want. It's a free service. You just want to make sure you're not waiting till the last minute to research a paper, because you're going to need to have time to get these books sent over to you. Now, the other thing is that it is okay to make projections, okay? So let's say, for example, you're looking at this and you find a source that's talking about emperor portraits, but let's say they're emperor portraits that were painted during the Sung dynasty, which is about seven centuries later. Now be careful, but you can kind of project some of those ideas onto what you're seeing here. And the reason why is because there's a consistency. This type of tradition of showing these emperors in this fashion is really consistent throughout China. So what is applicable in terms of content and sort of intent of communication is similar to what we see here, what we'd see in later paintings and earlier paintings as well. So think about typology, the type of artwork, and if it is a similar type that shows up before or later in art history, you can kind of use that to inform your evidence. The final thing, and I think this is actually going to be the most helpful to you, is that you don't have to use strictly art history books in your research. And in fact, I actually rarely ever use art history books in my own research. Art history is wonderfully interdisciplinary. And so, for example, let's say we're researching this painting here, Emperor Wu Jin. What you could do is you could look for books on Chinese culture, Chinese society, Chinese clothing, Chinese politics. And you can use that information to then support your analyses. So hopefully this tutorial and your little collection of hints regarding research will be helpful to you as you prepare to write your research paper. Good luck!